every once in a while you'll look at the camera during class, and you feel like you're like seeing through my soul. And I'll jump up like, I'm out of Zoom right now. Like, can you see me? I just hear it every time.
I can. I get scared every time. Yeah, I know it is odd because I can't see you, but when I see our numbers, like right now, there's only one person on. I wonder if I click. Oh, another off. So somebody joined and was like, "Yeah, he's looking at me." I also have students. So this particular channel I used when I was teaching high school, and so I had a bunch of my high school students. They followed me, because I would, like, if I was going to be absent or something, I would upload my instructions onto this channel, or when I taught English, I would read stories to them on there that I needed to have the audio for. And so a bunch of my high school students followed me just to be dorks. It wasn't ever necessary, but because it was never live. And so I know a bunch of them still follow, and I always wonder, like, how many of them ever click on and just go, "Oh, what's he lecturing about today?" Just to kind of be goofballs with me. I'm surprised nobody's commented on it though. Oh, comments are on. Oh, that's why. Have you guys tried commenting?
I mean, I think I thought about it at some point.
But I mean, like, commenting on the video or commenting in, like, the conversation?
On the live.
I've blocked the conversation thing, but can you comment on the video? No, I can't. Oh, okay. Oh.
I think you can block the live stream. I think it also blocks on that.
Okay. Yeah, I did that because I can't supervise it, and I don't know who's going to ever pop on and watch outside of this class. Not that who would, but I mean, there's trolls. So I just wanted to keep that. You don't even have to worry about it. All right. Well, welcome to. If you don't have a placard on it, do you have a placard? Does somebody not have a placard? Let's go. See, I mentioned food. All of a sudden, I got hungry and we're like, very nice. Full hot dog and bread full of both sides, first name, last name. Welcome to lecture 4, Power, Authority, and Government topic. This is the last one. This is the last lecture of that topic. This time, or at least 6:45 this time next week, we will officially be halfway through the semester. Technically, there's the 1 week. It's technically now 2 weeks, I think, after our final class, because we've got like the finals week and then we have spring break. But in terms of actual like class time, in terms of lectures and stuff, this time next week is the halfway point. So we're officially almost at the halfway point. And then think this, the assignment you guys turn in next, Monday, is assignment 3 of 7. So we are now 2 weeks and 3 days, I think, 2 weeks and 4 days, I guess, away from being 4 down, 3 to go. So it's, we're also close to being like over, almost, over halfway over. So it's flying by, like I said. I'll try to get, everything graded as quickly as possible, of course. But this is the last topic of this series, is revolutions. So we're going to be talking about just 2 revolutions, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Technically, it's kind of like Arab revolutions. There are technically kind of 4 revolutions. They're known as the Atlantic revolutions because of this U.S., which at the time was just a Atlantic coastal country. The French Revolution, which obviously, their west coast is the Atlantic Ocean. The Irish Revolution, which obviously the island of Ireland resides in the Atlantic, as does the Haitian Revolution. Haiti resides entirely in the Atlantic, and all 4 of these kind of played out in the same kind of period of time. But the United States one is obviously probably primarily important of those 4 for very obvious reasons. And the French Revolution is right up there with it for obvious reasons, as well as the unobvious, that they were just nuts. And the French Revolution, the primary French Revolution, there were like 7 of them, is just like chaos. It was, hey, let's overthrow the government. How far should we go? And if you think of like a stereo novel, it goes up to 10. They're like, can we go up any higher? Let's try 11. Let's try 12. Let's try 13. And it just went off the rails, which makes a lot of fun to study. In fact, to that point, I mean, the French Revolution part of this discussion is only about, half the class. I highly recommend, if you have any interest in history whatsoever, I highly recommend when I give the, if you want to learn more slide, looking into some of those, anything, to just kind of learn a little bit more about the French Revolution, because there's so much I can't even get into. And it's not just like boring stuff, it's like these people were nuts. And that's what makes it interesting. And, in a sick way, kind of fun. Like, obviously, there's always death in war. And so it does suck from that context, but at least from like, well, okay, it happened, we get that, now where do we find interesting stuff? It's interesting. So, revolutions. Today we're going to analyze the concept of nationalism. So again, the age of revolution was 1776 to 1799. Again, the primary two revolutions are the American Revolution and the French Revolution. These were the two kind of big Enlightenment revolutions. That both of them kind of succeeded on the backs of these ideas that Enlightenment thinkers, political thinkers in particular, put forth as they tried to question exactly what is the nature of society, what is the nature of man, what could be the future nature of government. And the two have a very fun kind of like connection between the American and French revolutions, in particular in regards to George Washington, we see up top, and Lafayette, General Lafayette, we see on the bottom. This, of course, is George Washington's estate in Mount Vernon. Has anybody ever been? You've been? You guys been? Cool. I went in 2010, 2011. When did you go?
It was a 8th grade Washington, D.C. trip.
About what year, though?
I think 20.
20 what? 16?
I don't, it's really fuzzy. Like between 14 and 15.
14. When did you guys go?
Oh, like 14.
But yeah. When you were there, was the key to the Bastille there? Do you guys remember? It was? So I went in 2010, and unfortunately, the key was not there because, and actually maybe the key was there, but it was like sitting down or something. Anyway, the housing had been like kind of degrading, and so they were repairing it when I happened to go. But the story of it is kind of really cool. It's a key from the Marquis de Lafayette to specifically George Washington. So the French, the United States does not become the United States. We don't win the revolution without French aid, money, and soldiers, in particular their navy. And so the United States and France had a very close relationship, and in particular the hatred of England and so forth. I think the French probably hated the English more than the Americans did, but regardless. And so when the United States won, George Washington's general and kind of the figure of this movement, he really did become the face. He's not only the general who presided over the Constitutional Convention, he was part of the Continental Congress. He was obviously the first president. He was kind of the face of the revolution, if anybody was. He got a portrait of him, not that he chose it, but the French, new French government after the revolution placed a portrait of him up in their parliament, which still hangs to this day. The Americans actually have a portrait of the Marquis de Lafayette in, I believe it's in the House as well. But moreover, Washington got a gift from Marquis de Lafayette, which was the key to the Bastille. So what the Bastille was this armory and prison. And housed, during the French Revolution, it housed political dissidents, but it also had a large control of weapons that the revolutionaries wanted access to. And so very much like the Boston Massacre, the events that occur, which I'll get into in a few moments, the events that occurred at the Bastille became kind of this like promotional, political kind of spin event that kind of helped to further along this idea of revolution. Well, what happened at the Bastille was that a group of revolutionaries come up to it and bang on the door like, give us your guns. We want the arms within. And the general in charge of the Bastille was like, yeah, I can't do that. I mean, it's treason. I'm not going to give you guys weapons to overthrow the government. He goes, but leadership, come in and let's talk. So they literally come and they have tea. And essentially, the general's like, yeah, I can't do that. I'm not going to commit treason. Like, my job is to protect the king, to protect the government. Like, that ain't going to happen. He goes, but I'll tell you what, I won't give them up to anybody. I won't put them in use. I won't let them be used against you. So how about that? Like, I can give them to you, but I also make sure they're not used against you. As the leadership was like, all right, cool. The revolutionary leadership was like, all right, cool. We accept. That's it. That's the best you can do. That's fair. Well, secondarily, there were a number of cannons in the windows, and those, those windows are the steel, and those cannons faced out against, outward. Well, there was a mob out there waiting for the revolutionary leadership to return and let them know what's going on. And once they left out, they're like, once the leadership left, they're like, hey, they won't give it to us, but they also won't fire on us, or they won't use them against us. Well, the general secondarily had the cannons pulled from the windows as a sign of peace. Like, look, these aren't been fired on you. Well, the mob, again, the French people are kind of nice. And the mob took that sign of peace as an act of war, stormed the Bastille, murdered everybody, took the weapons, and burned the place down. Well, then, that event then kind of became this kind of partial rallying cry. We've just destroyed the Bastille, no longer holds political dissidents, we've got arms and weapons. We just destroyed this sign of persecution and tyrannical rule or what have you. And much like the Boston Massacre, which, those soldiers committed no crimes, and yet the event was used as a rallying cry for all Americans. The same can be said for the Bastille. The pulling of the cannons as a sign of peace, actually the mob took as, oh my gosh, they're loading the cannons, they're going to fire on us. It was a trick, and stormed the place. So the key, though, one of the few things that remained was then given to the Marquis de Lafayette, who then gave it as a sign of friendship, revolutionary brothers, basically, to George Washington. And so the story goes that if you guys heard, you might have heard more recently, because I know it's one of the first things to really talk about. Because if I recall correctly, you guys remind me, this is the foyer. Like, you walk in, this is like the first living room, correct? Do you guys remember? I'm pretty positive. Like the front door is like right here, and then you walk in. Well, the key hangs right here. Washington didn't actually hang the key anywhere. I think he had like in storage, and it actually did get lost for a while. It just kind of disappeared. His estate had just kind of stored it somewhere and didn't keep track of it after he passed. Well, then, a few decades ago, 100 years ago, something like that, it was found. And then the question is, well, where did they place it? Eventually, they placed it back in his house, and his estate put it up here on display. So when you walk in, you can actually see the key to the Bastille, which was that French sign of part of the revolution. All right, we have a first what say you? Socialists and your partners. What is a revolution, and why do revolutions occur? So kind of two parts. What is a revolution, and why do revolutions occur? Socialists and stock their neighbors. Ready, set, go. And you guys don't forget that you have to, for participation, you have to send not only the answers to the what say yous, but you also have to send full notes showing that you watched the whole lecture. So you just send me those in the email as well. For these, you don't have to do like full paragraphs or anything. It's literally a sentence or two. You just have to answer it completely. But then you also have to show the notes, otherwise they don't give participation points. All right, ready, set, go.
It can be seen as two ways. The peaceful revolution time we put on with the British. And then you have people all Americans or some so yeah, it's just like change of government. It's normally because of the policy, I think a good example is when Japan was taking over what was being during the trade agreements. British people were like, but I definitely agree with that. Because it didn't have to fall back.
Right.
So that's why there's a lot of bureaucracy. Yeah. Same with the Americans, like tax, monarchy being not dealing with family.
Oh, right, man. Joanna, your placard is by far the most creatively designed in here. I really like it. I always offer, and if anybody wants to be creative with theirs, please do. It's, you know, a little bit more unique than a gray card with a big, you know, name on it, but yours is purple. Lobes up, bro. Or ma'am. I'm so used to saying brother. Like, lobes up. So let's say, what are your answers, definitions? What is a revolution and why did it begin? Just
Full overthrow of power, and they occur because the people that are underneath the power board and the power are unhappy with how things are being run.
well, if they're in power, they really revolt.
Well, like Mark, well,
I would totally subscribe to the idea that people underneath the power want to change how things are run, but if the people are in power, why revolt? You're in power.
have you seen Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker?
I have.
So you know how when General Hux is like, sorry, spoilers. So General Hux is like that guy. He's like, I just want to see Kylo Ren fail.
I just love though how you're referencing literally one of the worst sci-fi movies of all time. Yes, 7, 8, 9 should have never been made. I really hope someday George Lucas can regain control and say, okay, we're going to pretend that those didn't exist. Let me retell what really happened. Yeah, no, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, that guy is like, oh yeah, let me take him out. It's like, what? No, I know but that's not a revolution. That's an assassin. I mean, like, the guys that tried to assassinate Hitler, were they revolutionaries? You know, and Valkyrie, I think they're more of just assassins, you know.
So they're assassinating for what purpose? To create a revolution.
I think they're assassinating just to stop a madman from destroying the world.
Yeah.
Or in regards to Kylo Ren, a madman from destroying many worlds. So again, I subscribe to everything you said, overthrow of government, changing the way of things, specifically by people beneath leadership. I think I mean, you guys tell me, do you agree with me or Justin? Not to throw Justin on the bus, I'm just saying. You know, I just don't see it as necessarily being the people in leadership trying to cause a revolution, because that's the whole point. They don't have power traditionally. I think Huxley was just kind of another in a long line of poorly written characters in those movies. I don't mean to. Do you love those movies? Am I like?
Do I love those movies?
Yeah, those 7, 8, 9.
I mean, they're okay. They're not 4, 5, 6. They're not even 3.
Yeah,
but they're okay.
I think they're visually good. I think the story is just horrible. And it sucks because I do enjoy the first 6, and Clone Wars is a fantastic TV show that I'm so upset with Disney for destroying.
Oh, Mandalorian.
Mandalorian's fantastic. Yeah, that's it. I'm glad we can be friends again. Eric, did you have your hand up?
No.
Oh, I thought okay, okay.
I feel like someone in power could be part of a revolution if they weren't like the top person.
So they're not in power, then?
They're in like some sort of position of power, but definitely not like how.
So okay, but by that definition, aren't we all in a position of power? The question is just how much, and whether or not we're the one calling the shots.
The person with the most power.
Well, exactly. So I mean, that's why I'm asking: can the person with the most power be revolutionary? I mean, you guys maybe you can talk into it. I don't see it. Yeah.
I think
Gotcha.
revolution is where the people with absolutely no power over anything combine themselves together to get the power that they want to fix a problem that they have. Like
example,
So the
when
powerless.
yeah, the powerless coalesce to get the power that they so need to fix a problem that they have.
Yeah.
Which, let's just say for example, let's take the French Revolution for a second. A lot of
Spoilers.
Yeah, spoilers. During the times of hardship, the bread price was skyrocketing. No one could eat. Everyone was starving, and they were constantly asking the government, "Can we get some bread just to feed our for our ability to live?"
Yeah.
And they would go to vote when the king collaborated all the groups together, and this would happen. The two big groups would all vote.
So you really are spoiling my entire lecture.
I'm sorry.
So what's the point of revolution? What's
The
the
point of
definition?
revolution is where. I'm sorry if this went on the entire thing. I just love revolution stuff.
I offer a little bit more specific specificity.
It's where they just all the powerless come together to
So it is though where you're saying the powerless, those without power come together.
I was just trying to give an example.
Those with. I know I get it. I totally get you. All right.
So this might be totally like far-fetched and just like
Dude, we're bringing Star Wars in. Anything's on the table.
so like we were talking and I brought up the whole like BLM movement and how it's the riots and then how they were like destroying cities and then I didn't bring something to the group, but like how Seattle they overthrew basically everything. They're like, oh, like we're in charge now.
So this is real quick. BLM didn't destroy cities. They would destroy certain areas. There's no doubt. The riot and looting was heinous and horrific, but it wasn't like citywide ever. Seattle, it was a small section. It was several blocks, but it wasn't. And they didn't overthrow the government either. They tried to create an anarchist zone, a government-free zone. And that also might have started as BLM, but it totally evolved into something much, just not almost in my opinion, but so I just want to kind of bring the scale down to your point, though, is continuous. Not wrong. I just wanted to bring it down.
So I just don't know if that would be considered like an act of revolution.
Okay, so I don't know how the BLM could be revolutionary per se. Some of the leadership might have wanted, but I don't think the general populace of those groups ever had a unified opinion or unified goal. It was very nebulous, hence why you get riots and looting. I mean, riot, one thing, but looting in particular, it's like, there's no revolutionary, that's just, thievery. However, that one group in Seattle, I suppose hypothetically their intentions were a bit more unified because they actually did manage to cordon off part of the city, take control, and create this little miniature anarchist state. So hypothetically, they could be considered on some level revolutionary, I think. Their ideas are certainly not revolutionary. In other words, their ideas aren't new. Their ideas are very much just like overthrow the government, which by definition is revolutionary, I suppose. However, they never had any access to government. In fact, the mayor was is a complete moron and really helped them out. It was just hey, we're going to avoid, we're going to pretend like you're not breaking any laws, even though they were technically breaking every law. So therefore, that almost, I will grant that almost lessens any actual impact they had because the government kind of turned the other way. It was yeah, go ahead, take that area. We don't even care anymore. And that's no revolution. That's just kind of, again, it's anarchy. It's just kind of wastefulness. Anybody else? Yeah, what are they called again? I forget. I'm basically trying to think of the name of the entire time. That group. Anyone remember? And, no, yeah, the area.
Chop. Jazz Chop.
Chaz. Yeah, that's right. That's right. I was trying to. I was what are they called again? Chaz. Yeah. Which I think is French for the guys are a bunch of losers, something like this. So, all right. So, what is a revolution? When do revolutions occur? Well, similarities between them. There are several similarities between general revolutions and overthrow of power. Chaz never overthrew anything. They just cordoned off a couple of streets. BLM didn't overthrow anything. They just, unless you want to talk about overthrowing management of a couple stores who, were emptied out. So an overthrow of power,
which led to extremists coming to power. The revolutionaries, hypothetically, those are extremists. They had to go to such lengths in order to overthrow the power. And then subsiding to a more moderate time in which the idea of the kind of the destruction of this status quo ends, and the new status quo becomes the new normal, or the new government becomes the new status quo. So, in metaphor, I believe it was pre-COVID, it's just ironic. A metaphor could be that a fever that rises due to complaints among the people and a breakdown of the body of power, the fever rages. It is made clear that the people cannot tolerate the fever, and this rage of illness, if you will, is replaced with an improved body of power and a happier people. So in other words, you get really sick, your body fights off this illness, hence, in that time you've got the revolution. And then when your body is able to fight it up completely, you develop those antibodies, which essentially then gives you a happier, stronger sense of being. It's kind of a new normal. You didn't have the antibodies before, you have them now. So all societies have tensions and signs of discontent. So it's not like there's ever been a singularly happy, pleasant, peaceful people. Every society has issues. And yet, revolutions do not always occur. So take, for example, the Great Depression, in particular the decade of the 1930s. Nothing went right for millions and millions of people. Starvation, no homes, no jobs, no work, nothing. And there were tremendous signs of discontent, tremendous tension and sense of discontent. So there was labor unrest. This was a time where unions were slowly starting to become a thing, and these unions would lead to literal battles on union property. Like, honestly, people shot and killed by military, by soldiers. We had high unemployment, tremendous crime, often because of starvation and just desperation, and attacks on civil liberties, all without a revolution. So then we do have, as Joanna pointed out, who pointed out Bailout? Eric pointed out Bailout. So as Eric pointed out, we had riots, we had looting, we had then the outbreak occurred first, in which we have lockdowns, quarantines in some places. I mean, we were blessed, for those of you who lived in Arizona, or have lived in Arizona throughout this entire thing, we've been pretty blessed by no real lockdowns. So we've had a quarantine, but our government kind of kept a lot of things open. We still had a lot of fluidity. A lot of other places, people are basically told you're not allowed to leave your home. So you have that going on. You've got obviously the masking, where you're mandated to wear a mask. Like right now, if one of you guys would take the mask off, I'm technically supposed to tell you to put it on or get out. I mean, I have this authority to mandate this over you. And then we had high unemployment. I mean, millions of people lost their jobs. Millions of people lost lots of money. I can tell you in particular, my wife and I lost over $12,000 that we were expecting in income. $12,000 gone, kind of like that. It affected a lot of people. And at neither time, whether it's 1930s or in 2020, no revolution. So why is it that we had these open signs of tension and disconnect in both of these decades, the last 100 years? And yet, 18th century France, 18th century America, 20th century Russia, they have revolution. But the 20th and 21st centuries, we don't. What changed? Why is it that we had plenty of unrest and tension, but no revolution? Does anybody have a theory? Yes, John.
I think it's just people can't be unified or agree on what they want, so it just becomes chaotic and dispersed. The groups of people.
Oh, okay. So because there couldn't be unified direction, it just kind of wears itself out. Fascinating. Why is it though that we can't come up with a new unified direction?
I think people just can't agree on what they want. There's not enough people to agree on one thing in order to have one kind of leadership to go out and actually make anything different. Everybody wants a different thing, different opinion. The generations have become more self-obsessed, so it's hard to work together.
Fascinating. I love that perspective. And actually, you just reminded me of an article. So I'll offer a little bit more honesty, a headline. I didn't read the article. I didn't get a chance, and I haven't thought about it since I saw it a few weeks ago. But it was something to the effect of, it's a good So in regards to the BLM, you know, like the Black Lives kind of movement, it's there is no MLK, and that's a good thing. Was the headline something effective? And I didn't get a chance to read the article. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I really want to go back and see what the point was, because on the surface, I completely and vehemently disagree. And I think to your point too, I mean, because there isn't strong centralized leadership, there isn't a strong focus, it dissipates because there isn't enough agreement on what actually should happen. You get all these, hence why you have riots and looting. MLK put forth a specified, specific directions. And this is how we're going to go about it. This is how we make change. Non-violent, peaceful protests. We wear the opposition out because we don't fight back. The more you fight back, the more enraged the other side becomes. So the more peaceful we become, the stronger we get, because they will wear out, and that will bring them to the table. And that was literally his point. I talked about them in my U.S. history class. And I wonder if that's why. I wonder if that's exactly why we haven't had anything, certainly in the last year, because there's all these voices and not one that rises above the fray to kind of lead them all. I love that perspective, John. Does anybody else have one? Simon?
She said sort of the same thing, but like the self-obsession and the comfort we have and the laziness that people have.
That comes from that?
Yeah, because if there's COVID or something like what happened last year and still is happening with people, like we can still stay in our homes and have phones and food, and obviously like money is a problem too, but like that hasn't gotten to the point where we're going to unify rioting either. And so I don't know.
So, but because of all the personal possessions they already have, it's kind of like being a kid.
We're not like 18th century or 20th century when people like actually had way tougher lives than us. And so they were actually trying to like rebel for a reason, for
survival.
So yeah, more survival than anything we are now. And so now it's easy to like all the stuff that we consider that young people consider to be maybe revolutionary is not really revolutionary. It's usually just making themselves look good.
Making themselves look good?
Yeah.
Yeah, just in front of the camera.
Yeah.
Their own camera.
Yeah.
Look at me, I'm a revolutionary. I bought new shoes just for the moment. You know, it's funny. Have you ever been grounded to your room and gone, I got a video game system, I got a big TV, I've got a mini fridge or whatever. That's a good point, because today it's like during a quarantine, it's like, okay, I've got video game systems, I got TVs, I got stereo systems, I've got the internet, I've got cell phones. I mean, think about it. You can Zoom anybody, you can FaceTime anybody. It's not like you're lacking contact. So that's a good point too. I mean, so you got self-obsession and you've got comfort. Yeah, like the poorest among us are kings compared to many people on other continents. So great points. Anybody else? You did have your hand up.
I agree with both of those points.
They're fantastic points.
Yeah, but I think I can add to that. I think the education that we've had throughout these years has really helped us see foresight, and I think that helps because I think people know that if a revolution happens and that we try to take over the government, trade kind of just stops, because other countries that we have trade agreements with kind of just like try to figure out, like, are these new people allies or enemies? And if they win, can we figure out that answer as quickly as possible?
So, and that's why revolutions haven't occurred in our country?
No, I think that the other two reasons combined with that all contribute to why it hasn't happened. Sure, it might be that's a very small percentage. I will admit that's a very highly stretched thing. I think the other two reasons.
It's just the lower down the line.
Yeah, it's lower down the line. That if it does happen, then that option will flare up.
There is no doubt that if a revolution were to occur, well, excuse me, not if, let me just speak to, when revolutions occur, economies change as well. And so there is a period of time where even for the victors, people are struggling while the economy reshuffles, realigns, the government structure comes into place and decides, figures out how to work with certain aspects of society.
So yeah, I mean, and that's on a local level. So then, of course, on the international level, there would be a lot of economic issues in regards to trade, as to who can we get trade agreements going really quickly, because there are people who need goods from out of the country. So that's definitely one of those issues that would have to be dealt with for sure. Fantastic job. All right, so many theories in regards to why revolutions even occur in the first place exist, but they do not always explain what happened in particular in the United States, which is our first focus, of course. One assumed necessary ingredient of revolution is widespread discontent, and it usually comes from starvation. As Jack was referencing earlier, when it's kind of fast forwarding to the French Revolution, the United States, I keep saying United States. At the time, they were just the American colonists. The American colonists at the time of the Revolution weren't hungry. They were well-fed. They were pretty much the wealthiest people societally on the planet from top to bottom. There was no famine. There was no disease. Everybody had space. Cities weren't necessarily overcrowded. And if a city did overcrowd, you wanted to get out of it, you could move because there were plenty of space. There was no shortage of resources in terms of fishing and not just land itself, but wood and mining. And they had everything going for them. All they had to deal with was a wacky government in England, but they had it all. So you turn to England again, turn to France again. Reference Jack's discussion of their literally starving to death in the streets, which is this image back here. And Americans were doing really well compared to the rest of the world. So revolutions do tend to have certain things in common, though. One necessity is they do start with discontent of some kind. Of course, the American colonists did have an issue with the British government, but it's not always clear to what extent wrongs are real or perceived. So it is interesting to note, though, that 4 of the 4 major revolutions of history, that is the English of the 1600s, the Americans, the French of the late 1700s, and the Russians in the early 1900s, all began with governments trying to get more money out of the people. So if taxation is a driving factor for revolution, why hasn't, again, the United States revolted in the 20th century? But we are now more taxed than even the colonists were at their peak at that time. Why is it that we're more accepting of higher taxes today than they were just 250 some odd years ago? Think about it. You guys, when you go to QT, spent more money on taxes than the American colonists were, if you include the stamp tax, down the line, the sugar tax, all of that. You pay more at QT than they did, and yet they revolted. Why don't you?
I think the big thing then was taxation without representation, which is they didn't have a say in what they were taxed on, how much. And we get to vote on some of those things and kind of consent to be taxed that much. And I don't know why it doesn't bother us it did there, other than that we kind of have a choice or feel like we have a choice.
Okay, so because we're going to choose those who are taxing, we're more apt to accept it, because at least back then they didn't have the right to decide who was doing the taxing.
And generally we kind of know where it goes and what certain things are taxed for, like property tax being for education.
Okay, so there's a paper trail too that we could follow if we wanted to. Joanna?
I think people just lack the energy to fight it. They just kind of accepted that this is a way of life. It's
Yeah.
okay for the government, your taxes, it's taken out of your paychecks and stuff, so you don't have to do the math until April and stuff.
And at that point, it's too late. You just give up. You go, I'll fight it next year, and then you don't. And, Biden's listening right now. He knows now. Just tax them all. Yes, Emma.
I think there are more heinous crimes when it comes to avoiding taxes, because nowadays if you were to try to fight it, all of a sudden you're being accused of tax evasion, and all of a sudden they're fraudulent, and there's so many more repercussions of just simply not paying your taxes for a year versus avoiding taxes from someone who's all the way like across the sea. Makes sense.
Well, no, it does make sense. They did send obviously tax collectors here, so there were people who, like, lived here just to collect taxes. But yeah, I mean, essentially, and those would be the people too that the revolutionaries would tar and feather. So it was, I think, far fewer number. Well, I could guarantee it was far fewer number, certainly, than it is the number of people who work for the IRS today. So there is that as well. I mean, as you said, you decide, I'm going to pay your taxes, and believe the IRS is on your butt immediately. Whereas back then, it probably was a lot more difficult. There were a lot fewer people who were actually in charge of collecting as well. Very good. Anybody else? Great job. So let's look at the American Revolution. Now, I'm going to assume you guys have been going to public school pretty much your whole lives. So you know about the American Revolution. So I'm going to kind of fly this. So some of the American grievances were, of course, numerous navigation acts, as well as the implementation, excuse me, of restricted border trade, which just wouldn't allow them to trade with anybody outside of England. The Crown appointed governors who decided when the legislatures who were elected would meet, or if to dissolve them entirely. So people really didn't have kind of, in many cases, true oversight over their own local colonial governments. The courts are controlled by the king. There were numerous colonial wars: the King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, the French Indian War, 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War, of course, being the last one of the British government Parliament wanted to tax the colonists specifically, because they're like, hey, that whole thing pretty much took place in your backyard, and we're going to leave a standing army there to kind of keep protected from the Indians, and you need to help pay for that. And of course, you have George Grenville, the Prime Minister, and the Stamp Act. You have the Currency Act of 1764, which prevented colonists from printing money, which devalued the British pound. The Quartering Act, which of course would be the predecessor to the Third Amendment to the Constitution, which says that soldiers cannot be housed without your consent in the event of war. Then you do have, as Faith was just saying, the idea of no representation, or no taxation without representation, because essentially the Continental Congress, when they sent their letters back and forth to the Parliament King, they were like, listen, if you give us a voice, you can tax us. Just give us a role in the decision of when and how much to tax. The colonists were not against taxing on a fundamental level. They got the government bills to pay, and where do they get their money? They get their revenue from the people. So they were just saying, give us some representatives in there in the Parliament, and we'll be okay. But what was the retort? Well, it was virtual representation. In other words, the King and Parliament were like, no, we won't do that because we have your best interests in mind anyway. We've got your back, so we don't need you here to have a voice. And essentially treating them like second-class citizens. Like, well, don't worry, we're good. It's kind of like a father and child. Child might say, let me have a voice in the decisions of my life. And a father going, yeah, no, I got your best interests in mind. I know what to do here, kid. That's why you go to bed at 8 o'clock. That's why you have to eat your vegetables. That's why you don't get 3 helpings of dessert, that kind of thing. Like, I got this. Well, imagine a parliament or a government telling its people, kind of, treating them in a very similar way, like father, mother, and a child. Only the children are full-grown adults who fight wars on behalf of the government. There is no virtual representation. You don't have our best interests in mind. You're just trying to hold us down. So you got the protests and eventual repeal of the Stamp Act. You eventually got the Townshend Acts, the Revenue Act, blah, 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 blah. And overall, the ideological response was, listen, because you don't give us a voice, because we don't have a role in the decision-making of our future, you're tyrannical, you're dictatorship, you are controlling us without our consent. That is, something we must and is worth fighting for. So, of course, one of the catalytic events is the Boston Massacre. And this is the event that I reference closely to the story of the Bastille. There were 2 events that really should not have had any kind of revolutionary appeal to it, but then were kind of spun politically into kind of, again, catalytic events that led to war. So this was, of course, this was an engraving, I think it was silver cut or woodcut, by Paul Revere, the night of Boston Massacre. And within 2 weeks was circulated around the entire country. The entire the 13 colonies, every newspaper had this in there and discussed how the British soldiers fired upon these innocent civilians. Now, if you don't know the story, very, very quickly, the soldiers actually did nothing wrong. It started out as one soldier guarding a federal court, which was just his job to watch this court. And this mob just kind of slowly kind of developed over some local issues in Boston Common, eventually becoming a little unruly. So he called for some help, and some additional soldiers were brought up to just kind of really help this one kid. And I believe that soldier was only like 15, 16 years old too. He wasn't very old. And it was just to kind of like defend him and like, hey, you guys, can you get out of here? Can you move this mob? The mob, the citizens they're screaming at them, they're throwing snowballs, they're throwing rocks, they're throwing, things at the soldiers. And the soldiers are being told, do not fire. Do not fire. Let's, let them kind of wear out. Well, somebody fires. And to this day, nobody knows from which side did who fire and who took that first shot. But in the skittish moment of fear, as all these people are just kind of going nuts on these soldiers, the rest of the soldiers then boom, 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 throw a volley into the crowd and kill 3 people. The first to die is a black former slave, freedman named Crispus Atticus, and literally becomes the first death of the American Revolution. They are all acquitted. And do you guys, anybody who knows the story, know who their lawyer was, who the soldier's lawyer was? Future President of the United States, John Adams. He was their lawyer. He got them acquitted. A couple of them were punished, but they had their thumbs branded. It was like nothing like severe. It was, well, you really still shouldn't have fired, but whatever. In the end, they did nothing wrong. And yet Paul Revere made this sound like these soldiers were just out to kill. They're out for blood. So, as you can see real quick, we're not going to watch it. It's 7 minutes long. This is a hyperlink that if you go back, want to watch this, it's cool. It's 7 minutes long. Last year, if you didn't know, is the 250-year anniversary of Boston Massacre. And I guess that a group of reenactors reenacted every year on the anniversary. Well, last year was a big deal because it's 250th anniversary. And so they show this like, they're literally, the camera's like this close. I mean, Matt's falling asleep. I got to pick this up a little bit. They're like this close. And so it's really cool as they reenact it. Here's like the really strange thing. It was March, I think, 10th. Do you guys know what happened on March 17th, 2020? The nation went into quarantine. So the anniversary of this video is literally 1 week before, which just is like so crazy because there were thousands of people in the media watching this thing, and I'm like, there's so COVID there. There's like 100% COVID there, but we didn't know yet. 1 week later, we sure knew. So I recommend watching. So again, fly into a further defending the flames. In addition to quartering act, there's the Boston Port Bill, which closed the Boston Port until the colonists repaid for the Tea Party, Boston Tea Party. By the way, there are 2 crates that remain from the Boston Tea Party. I mean, there were hundreds that were thrown into the harbor, but only 2 remain that are like 100% saved from that event. If you're interested, look at it. It's cool. It's just kind of cool to see a picture. Administration of Justice Act, Massachusetts Government Act, Quebec Act. So all in all, the additional causes, there was a sense of national identity for the first time in colonial history. American citizens actually kind of felt, you guys put our phones and watches away. The colonists kind of really did feel a sense of unity and oneness. And actually, that played a really big role in everybody kind of feeling together. Benjamin Franklin said, we had best hang together, like stay strong in terms of this fight for revolution, or we shall surely hang separately. Colonies on really close terms. Again, the etching by Paul Revere, the Boston Massacre, is in every newspaper for 2 weeks. So that's really fast. Patrick Henry gave us a liberty or death speech, which showed unity of purpose. John Adams claimed that the revolution began in the hearts and minds of Americans with the Stamp Act in 1765. And then further, there are no avenues of redress. Again, they sent letters to the Parliament saying, like, give us representation, let us kind of tax ourselves on the good. They were shunned every single time. Americans believed that we had always governed ourselves because they were, as one of you guys had said, and like the king was across an ocean. They were disconnected.
It was called conservative because they were trying to conserve human dignity, rights of self-governance. But it was truly revolutionary because when, especially in particular, the Constitution was ratified, that was the first time in human history that any government had ever been created that was a true democratic republic the way this is. And so thus, if nothing else, the revolution produced the most profound document in history, that being a declaration. And further, their isolation from the mother country, the colonists that is, during most of the colonial period, helped develop the spirit of common interest. There was prospering, like I said, they were very wealthy, the people were. There were decades of changes in social, family, religious, and ethnic conditions that undermined the traditional deference to authority. In particular, the Enlightenment of the 1740s, that brought all 13 colonies, all 13 colonies together, kind of as one community in God. There were pastors who traveled to all 13 colonies and gave homilies. Catholics call it homilies, but Protestants call it. They call it homilies? Is it not lectures? I mean, when a pastor gives his sermon, thank you, that's the word. Gives sermons, all to literally like everybody knew who these pastors were. They were superstars among society, and it brought the people together. All right. So what say you? When was the end of the American Revolution? Was it 1783 when the war ended officially? Was it 1789 when the Constitution was ratified? Was it 1800 when the first peaceful transition of power took place between two political parties? So the first president, George Washington, was a Federalist, essentially. John Adams, the second president, was also a Federalist. And basically Congress, they were all Federalists, which would be akin to modern day lowercase d Democrats. 1800, though, is when Thomas Jefferson took office, and with them, the conservatives swept in power in both Congress, the House of Congress as well, which really was the first peaceful transition of power. We went from a lowercase d Democrat government for basically 12 years to a conservative government, smaller federal government type, direction, peacefully. Or is the revolution still going on to this day? So, what say you? A, B, C, or D? Social distance, talk to neighbors. Guys, set go. So just so you guys know on this, you can't just write A, B, C, or D and move on. You got to just say why. So A, B, C, D, and then just explain your reason why. Full sentence, 2 sentences. That's all. All right, let's see. Just kidding. All right, there. So, who said A, the revolution ended
when the war ended? Nobody thinks that? That's a first. I think literally, I've always had somebody. Who said B in 1789 when the Constitution was ratified? Whoa. Okay, Justin, what say you?
I feel like, so you start off with, the beginning of war, because most revolutions, I'd say, start with war, declaration, and something. They start with that over in 1776-ish, and then they're going, and then they win the war, but they're still, like, at that point, they're just a group of colonies that, have won a war. And once they get the Constitution, they're a new government, and that's a revolution of power, right? Then you take people that weren't in power, and now you have people in power for the new government.
Okay, very good. No, what did you say?
Well, we were talking about it, I was saying, okay, like, so the revolution after the war ends, and then in that time between the Constitution, that's like the those were pretty deep, they were kind of floundering, like, they were still doing okay, but they were kind of floundering a little bit, there wasn't a lot of, like, I don't know, it wasn't perfect at all, neither is Constitution, but it's a lot better.
It's a more perfect, that's what they say.
Yeah, exactly, it's a lot better, and so, like, when that happened, it was kind of like, cool, we had a revolution, we won this war, and now we have this like solid like document together to move forward. I feel like that's just like, I guess.
Very good. Matt and Jeff, what did you guys say?
We said B because like it was they won the war and they really still lived under the name of England and Britain until they had the Constitution really set them apart as their own nation.
Which kind of made them Americans.
Yeah.
Kind of, yeah.
Then they started calling themselves like officially Americans.
Very good. Who said C with the first peaceful transition of power? Nobody? Who says then that the revolution is still going on to this day? Okay, so I did not recognize. So everybody here says B? Wow, okay. So again, that's new. I always have people that say one more book. So, I'll just offer my position, and that's cool. The revolution is still going on to this day. Because if you think about it, if a revolution is changing a government, while the Constitution has allowed us to keep a solid structure of government in place for the last 200 some odd years, in essence, we overthrow the government all the time, and it's not overthrowing a government in and of itself revolutionary. So not only do we overthrow presidents, and we change direction with presidents in dramatic ways all the time. Biden, so this is my life, Biden is nowhere near where Trump is, who is nowhere near where Biden was, who was nowhere, Obama was, who was nowhere near where Bush was, and so on and so forth. The direction of those guys are so diametrically opposed, back and forth. That in and of itself is revolutionary. Hence why Thomas Jefferson called the election of 1800 the Revolution of 1800, because it had been Federalist power for 12 years, and all of a sudden, boom, it became this conservative power, this conservative government. They changed so much of that Federalist direction that's been set in place, and to the point where that election was very, very highly contested, very close, and a bunch of Federalists actually went to, I shouldn't say a bunch, several Federalists went to Jefferson and said, hey, listen, if you just state that you'll keep a couple of these primary Federalist structures in place, we'll make sure that you get it. We can end this election right now. And Jefferson was like, I'm not good with that. He's like, I'm being elected to go based on my conscience. And my conscience says that your structure sucks. And therefore, no, I will not agree to accept some of your, what I believe to be flawed, kind of pillars of government. So if we want to say that the revolution kind of came to a head with maybe the Constitution, because we haven't had a different governmental structure since, then I would say that an election is a bloodless battle. Hence why I do believe that the revolution still continues to this day, because we change our government all the time. And it's going to change again in 2 years, most likely. Right now, the Democrats control the House, Senate, and the presidency. Well, this past election showed that Republicans are very likely going to retake the House, which is going to change the government like that once again. Everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, but most projections showed that the Democrats were not going to win the election. I mean, I never saw a single poll that showed Trump winning, but that they were not only going to win the election, they were going to steamroll the Senate and steamroll and add seats in the House. They had like a 25 or 28 seat advantage on the effect that they were going to add seats. The thought was they're going to add like 5. The presidential election is one thing, but not only did they barely eke out a small victory in the Senate, and it required 2 runoff elections to do so, but the Republicans actually almost tied them in the House. So we're going to have a new government in that sense come 2022, most likely. So that is my argument for why the revolution doesn't end. It hasn't ended. That, and I'll end on this too. I really believe that due to the structure of our government, it's designed to be precarious. I mean, think about it. Think of how emotional people became over the 2020 election on either the Biden side or the Trump side. It was an extraordinarily emotional election. And there are a lot of people, tens of millions of people that right now are scared. They're not happy with the direction of the government. They're fearful that things are going to move too far in one direction. That places the nation on a kind of perpetual precarious line. We're not safe from the people rising up. It's obviously in our nature as an independently structured nation to want change. Hence why we change government all the time. And so we are walking that precarious line. Now, we're fairly balanced. We haven't really ever teetered one way or the other very much, but it does feel like that it will take less than one might think for there to be the kind of impetus for a revolution that really pushes the government in a very strong way. The people push the government in a very strong way. So I had a student in my last class ask, based on things that he has noticed and read, if I think the government, it's possible for there to be a revolution in the United States in the next couple of years. I don't think so. I don't think there's going to be a revolution. I doubt, although I can't say one way or the other, there'll be a revolution in our lifetimes. I don't think the United States is perpetual, though, and I think it was never designed to be perpetual. I think it's designed to be more perfect. But if it's more perfect, that means there still can be something more perfect. And I actually kind of think the United States is the country and the government that we have now that will lead to that better government someday down the line. It could be 100 years, it could be 200 years. I don't know. I just think the way it's set up, though, it isn't meant to be a perpetual system. It's meant to lead us to something better. And eventually there will be a push for something better. And we're the actors in that play, if you will. So, which is why I love talking this stuff, because it can be so theoretical. There's so many opinions and sort of positions one can have. Although, like I said, I do think it'll take something a lot less than what we think will actually be required for that kind of a revolution. All right. So the French Revolution. Two of my favorite words I've ever uttered in my life are ancien regime. That might sound silly, but I took French history for my BA. Really fun class. We don't offer it here at Grand Canyon, but if we ever got the chance at some point to kind of dive into the history of the French, it's fascinating because they're kind of nuts. They've had 7 revolutions. I mean, it's just revolution after revolution. They've had a revolution to bring about a government of the people, only to just hand it to Napoleon and say, "Hey, be our emperor instead." I mean, with even more power than the king, basically. So it's and they did it multiple times. So the ancien regime was the old regime, and this is essentially the government of Europe, the style of government at this time. That was absolute monarchs, that this one individual, this one monarch, king or queen, would have absolute total power. And what that really means on a fundamental level is that their word was law. If a monarch with absolute power said this was what it was, that's what it was. And if that monarch said, yeah, it's not that anymore, then it's not that anymore. I mean, the king would have, that was absolute power.
Now, it doesn't necessarily fall into dictatorial the way we know it today, because a dictator usually comes to power without people's consent. The monarchs at this time, they didn't only believe, but the people believed they were placed there by God. And so therefore, they were chosen for the people. And so Europeans just went along with it. And the monarchs too, they didn't think of themselves as dictators because they were born and raised to know, hey, the universe, certainly the French universe, revolves around you. And that's how they were taught. That's how they were, hey, you're the next king. You're in charge of this whole thing someday. Okay, like why would they think anything differently? So the classes of people that lived in these societies at the time were broken down essentially into two groups, the privileged and the under or unprivileged. The unprivileged generally paid taxes and funded the government and were treated quite badly, whereas the privileged people didn't or paid very little taxes and were thus treated quite well. It was essentially, hey, you got wealth, keep it. Hey, you don't have wealth, I need it. You know, it's a total cockeyed system, but it's just kind of how it was. So in France, there were 3 estates or 3 specific classes of people. The first estate was the Roman Catholic clergy. They made up 1% of the population of France. They were a privileged class. They were exempt from taxes, which is traditional, but Christian churches don't have to pay taxes, or at least pay very, very little, because their purpose is supposed to save souls. It isn't to gain wealth. So the Roman Catholic clergy at this time, their purpose was to save souls, but some of them found ways to gain wealth. And by the way, it's also here in the United States. I mean, their churches are non-profit, so the taxes that they pay is very, very minimal because, again, their purpose is something very specific. They owned, however, 10% of all French land that they then made even more money off of because they collected rents and fees, and some bishops and clergy were able to grow quite wealthy off of this federally granted land. The second estate was the nobility, essentially the wealthy class, so made up less than 2% of the population. They too were a privileged class. They paid few taxes, if any, but they controlled most of the wealth in the country. And because of their position of nobility, held key government positions, held key military positions, and then lived on country estates. Well, a country estate was basically, again, government land that the government gave to families, wealthy, noble families, and just said, here's 100 acres, it's free, it's yours, take it. No taxes, it was just like government land. So, I mean, imagine today, LeBron James, basically one of the most famous people in the country, because of his status in our nation as a wealthy guy, being told, oh yeah, you don't have to pay taxes because you're wealthy, and here's 100 acres for you to live on because you're wealthy. It's cockeyed, but now we think, well, yeah, tax him because he's a citizen, and why would you give him land? Make him pay for it. He earns the money, that sort of thing. Well, that wasn't quite the case here in France. And then finally, the third estate, which was by far the largest group of people, making up 97% of the population. That was then broken down into 3 or 4 groups, but bourgeoisie, these were the city-dwelling merchants, the factory owners, the professionals. They could be a bit more wealthy, but they're still the wealth. They were only wealthy of the third estate, and even if they had if they could earn kind of relative wealth to nobility, they still wouldn't be placed in nobility. They were just kind of a wealthy lower class. Then you had the sans-culottes, or the artisans and workers, and of course you had the peasants, who were the lowest of the group. These were poor with very little hope of ever rising up in position. They had to pay rents, they had to pay fees, they had very little money, they were taxed very heavily. They were certainly the unprivileged class. So the king got absolute power, so what would he do? What could he do? Well, he appointed intendants, who were little, petty tyrants who controlled, they're essentially like mayors, as we would know today, who governed France's 30 districts. He appointed the people and then governed them based on the king's wishes. He appointed the people who would collect his taxes and carry out his laws. And so just kind of move us over here real quick and show that he levied all taxes and decided how to spend the money, and he made all the laws. He controlled justice by appointing judges. He controlled the military. He could imprison anyone at any time for any reason. These are known as blank warrants of arrest or lettres de cachet. And he made decisions regarding war and peace. He was an absolute monarch. He held absolute power. Well, economically at this time, and by the way, like presidents in the United States are generally fairly well educated and before they get power. And even if it isn't necessarily a classroom education, they're educated by experience. That's why we don't generally elect young people to be president, because generally the older people have had life experience, business experience, and or governing experience, whether they've been in a house, they've been in the Senate, they've been a governor, that kind of thing. Kings are just told, you're king. And sometimes kings would take power at literally 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. They would make governing decisions, because how can a 5-year-old do that? They would have a prime minister, they have people in place to kind of make decisions in the interim. But regardless, it wasn't like they were trained. They were just told, you're king, so whatever you want for 25 million people, okay, there you go. So then you can really get a country into trouble, when there are economic problems. The king just doesn't have any necessary education or history to fall back on. They're kind of making a guess based on how they feel. So leading up to the revolution, France's economy was primarily based on agriculture, led by peasant farmers who bore the burden of the taxation. Again, the poorer you were, the more you paid the taxes, essentially, the more percentage of your income you paid taxes on. Then, at this time, there were a series of poor harvests, which meant the peasants had trouble paying the regular taxes. But more importantly, they also had trouble gaining enough income to buy food. Now, at this time, the primary staple of the French diet was bread, and it really has been kind of forever. Really, it's not been until like the last decade or two where the bakery had been forever the center of a town. Every morning, you went to the bakery. Citizens, literally, just every morning they go to the bakery. They get their bread for the day. They get different kinds of bread for different meals. The smell of the bread, wafting through the air, would fill a town, and that's how you knew that the baker was getting his stuff ready. And then it was also not only a place to get your food for the day, but it's also a place to meet your neighbors, to get to know people. It's kind of like what Americans kind of would think of as a bar. Like afterward, you'd go to a bar. You guys will understand what I'm talking about. Afterward, you'll go to a bar. You'll meet your friends. You hang out. You can kind of smell the bar food. And replace that with a bakery and maybe like coffee. And so, at the time, leading up to this, the wheat harvest were struggling. The farmers, just the land, the weather there was not a lot of room to produce enough wheat, so bread was becoming a little bit more scarce. Well, scarcity leads to higher prices. So the bakers are now charging more for their bread. Well, there also was not a whole lot of information shared with the peasantry as to why the prices of bread are rising. And I'll just skip forward real quick to here. Income spent on bread, 60% of one's income in 1787. In 1787, 60% of income was spent on bread. 1 year later, 80% of a peasant's income was spent on bread. And nobody was telling them exactly why this is happening. All they were knowing was they were going starving, as Jack was referencing. The people were literally dying in the streets of starvation because they could not afford the one basic necessity, and the government wasn't telling them why. And a lot of people started to believe, is the nobility hoarding it for themselves? Is the king kind of like raising prices to pay for their luxuries? Like, what's going on? There really wasn't a lot of information to say, well, no, our crops are failing, and so we're not able to produce as much as so poor harvest. So this then bourgeoisie often mentioned. Okay, all right. Well, then in the meantime, in the interim, France is going bankrupt. So not only is the price of bread going up, now the government's desperate for money, so they're starting to tax more and try to pay for a lot of their spending. Some of which was their funds were depleted because of wars, including the American Revolution, which now France and the United States doesn't win. But then also a percentage was spent on the lavish lifestyle of the king and his queen, Marie Antoinette. She was seen as wasteful spending, throwing extraordinarily lavish balls and spending a lot of money on her clothing and on her hair. So I don't go into it. This too is a hyperlink. I highly recommend, guys too. I recommend just clicking. This is like a 3-minute read, but 10 insane facts about Marie Antoinette's fabulous hair. It's nuts what she would go through for her hair, and the people she would hire. I mean, like, it was crazy. So the government just, the king, the monarchy is just blowing through their money. The government starts deficit spending, which the United States has been doing for years now. In fact, I actually saw a headline earlier, I didn't hear the article. The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, today announced that the United States federal government will be spending, hold on, let me see if I can pull up the headline. It's pretty intense. Oh, can I not get it? Okay, let's see. Oh, chicory there. Let's see. Oh. Oh, I wish I had. Washington. Okay, the United States federal debt is expected to exceed the size of the entire United States economy, meaning that if the federal government were to spend every penny that we make a year, it would not pay off all of our debt. So if we were to be taxed 100%, if every penny earned went straight to the federal government, they still could not pay off our debt, before Biden's stimulus plan is even counted, says the CBO. So talk about deficit spending that eventually led to a revolution. And the privileged class would not submit to being taxed. That would be in the first and second estates. At the same time, we've got the Enlightenment, and it's the Enlightenment thinkers that were kind of the impetus for the intellect of the American founders. In Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, he basically plagiarized John Locke, as I discussed on Tuesday, in his declaration going, this is why, and it's like, oh, that was John Locke, oh, that was John Locke, oh, that was also John Locke. Hey, he quoted John Locke. I'd have to fail him on it if he wrote a paper for us because he didn't cite anybody. And so what these scientists of philosophy, of thought, of ideas during the Renaissance discovered was laws that govern the world that weren't necessarily acts of miraculous moves, such as God. So these intellectuals or philosophies began to ask if natural laws might also apply to human beings, particularly to human institutions such as governments. These were secular in thinking. These thinkers were secular in thinking, meaning apart from God. They used reason and logic. They attempted to use reason and logic rather than faith, religion, superstition to answer important questions, and then used reason and logic to determine how governments are formed and question the idea of the divine right of kings. Like, how do we know for sure that God actually told you, King Henry XVI, that you should be in power? Why is it that we can't decide for ourselves who should govern ourselves? So long-term past the French Revolution, everything previously discussed, absolutism, unjust socio-political system, poor harvests, influence of the Enlightenment thinkers, including others. Short-term causes, deficit spending, bankruptcy, great fear, the worst famine in memory, and people were literally starving, they were eating each other. And then the estates generale. This is my favorite. So, what was the estate generale? Well, it was an assembly of representatives of the three estates: clergy, the nobility, and the general populace. It had no true power because, again, the king was an absolute monarch. But what it acted as was a consultative assembly. So they would come together at the behest of the king. The king had to call the estate generale into session, and then the king himself could end it. And it's again absolute power. What he says is law. But their objective is simply to recommend to the king their ideas of what to do based on the presumption of their the three estates coming together and willing to kind of accept certain changes among themselves. Generally, one estate gives something up for the others to kind of help out. So it simply served as an advisory board of the king, primarily presenting petitions from the various estates and consulting on fiscal policy. So it had no legal authority. It was legally allowed to exist, and the king could call it into service. So in preparation for the Estates Generales, which was to be held in the spring of 1789, the members of the three estates elected representatives. They had several dozen. Cashiers were these lists of grievances that were written by the people, and there was nothing written out of the ordinary. They simply asked for moderate changes, just like help us out, as Jack again was referencing, just like, hey, why can't you give us more bread? Why are we starving in the street? Why do you keep raising our taxes when we've got the least amount of money? Can we have some balance here? Very much like the colonists kind of pleading with the British, going like, well, pay taxes if you just kind of give us a voice. The people are kind of the same thing, like, we're not against paying taxes. We're not trying to overthrow the king. We're just like, we're dying here, literally. And what's held, people thought that was going to be a revolution. There hadn't been an Estates Generales in 175 years. And so it's like, hey, this is a really big deal. If we can fix this, this is kind of revolutionary, and it's done. Like, we can move on. We can continue on with our lives. There's a big problem. It wasn't fair. Each estate got one vote. Well, the first estate got one vote for only 130,000 people. The second estate got one vote for only 110,000 people. The third estate got one vote for 25 million people. Oh, and by the way, the king didn't have to listen anyway. Because again, what he says is law, not you. How do you think this went down? Did it go well? So here we have, this is a painting of that day, of the first day, the convening, I think it was May 5th, 1789. And again, the last time we called it, but 175 years prior. So there we have King Louis XVI right there. Now, recognize in religion that the seat to the right of the head of the table is the highest seat of esteem. So if you think about when Christ went to heaven, he seats at the right hand of God. All right, so contemplate what that means metaphorically. I mean, back then, if you were a left-handed, you were it was thought that lefties were evil. So people who were born, that's not an exaggeration, people who were born left-handed, they were forced to learn to write with and to be right-hand dominant. I mean, like, it was a bad thing to be lefty. So to King Louis's right hand was the first estate, or the clergy, the men of God. Then to his left, which again, another seat of esteem, but the second seat was the second estate, or the nobility. So where did the third estate go? In the back of the hall, in a seat of least esteem. 25 million people, oh yeah, just get back there. You stink. Like, you guys aren't educated anyway. Like, you're poor, man. Like, we don't want to talk to you. How do you think this went down? Well, the voting was conducted by estate, which meant traditional, which meant that each estate got one vote, which meant 250 or 240,000 people got two votes, 25 million people got one. Representatives from the third estate demanded voting by population, which would then give the third estate the greatest advantage. Well, the deadlock ensued. Why? First and second estate didn't want to give up power because they knew if the third estate got power, they were just going to tax them and change everything. So they said, no, we reject this. What do you think happened? It's kind of obvious. It's like we're literally the worst written movie script of all time. Like, hey, here's this really bad thing that's going to happen. Or, excuse me, here's this this kind of fork in the road. Is something good going to happen or bad? Well, it's bad. Okay, here's another fork in the road. Something good going to happen or bad? No, it's going to be bad. And it just went downhill. So King Louis, not wanting his power diminished at any level, said, hey, you guys that stink in the back get out. He kicks the third estate out and thinks that he can resolve the issues with just the first and second estate alone. 240,001 to 25 million. How are things going to go? So what do the commoners do? Nobody watched the show How I Met Your Mother? Okay, do you know there's a song that I think is played in that series twice. It's first by Robin, it's written by Robin's ex-Canadian boyfriend who plays this rock hair band. And the lyrics go, murder, all aboard the murder train. The second time they show it is when she's doing her television show and they're trying to get rid of puppies, like donate puppies. And they play that song and they said, hey, we got rid of every dog because nobody wanted them murdered. I hear that song in my head whenever I look at this slide. What do the commoners do? Well, they don't sing Kumbaya. The third estate declared itself the National Assembly. Louis XVI responds by kicking them out of the meeting and locking them out. The third estate relocates to the nearby tennis court where its members vowed to stay together and create a written constitution. In June, King Louis XVI relents and he orders the three estates to once again meet each other as the National Assembly and vote by population on a constitution for France. He doesn't want this, though, because a constitution is essentially going to reorganize government. It's going to take power from someone who has absolute power and has been raised his entire life to know that, hey, you were born with absolute power, and he doesn't want to give it up. So here's a painting from the tennis court oath. It's actually harder to say fast than you think. And it says, I'm going to skip a lot of this. The National Assembly, decrees that all members of this assembly shall immediately take a solemn oath not to separate and to reassemble wherever circumstances require until the constitution of the kingdom is established and consolidated upon firm foundations, and that said oath taken, all members, and each one of them individually, shall ratify this steadfast resolution by signatures. They're saying, boys, we're coming together, and much like Ben Franklin's, we shall hang together or surely hang separately. They were the same way. Like, we got to stick together. We are a lot of people. They are a few. All right. So let me fly to the rest of this when we're done. So what are the four phases of the revolution? Well, you have the National Assembly for 2 years, the Legislative Assembly for 2 years, the Convention for 4, and the Directory. And once this ends, they go, yeah, this whole self-governance thing, it's kind of overrated. Can we have an emperor again? And boom, Napoleon becomes emperor. And then they have got lineage again. It's just like, I'm telling you, they're nuts. They don't know what they want. So with the National Assembly, again, King Louis did not want the Constitution because, hey, it's going to limit his power, but he was forced, and because it was feared, he feared he was going to be forced to adhere to restrictions he did not want. However, news of his plan to use military force against the National Assembly reached Paris on July 16th, and as I referenced, people stormed the Bastille. So in this uprising in Paris, the people of Paris seized weapons of the Bastille. The Parisians themselves organized their own government, which they call commune, which is basically communism. Uprising then spread throughout France. Nobles are attacked. Many nobles escape and leave to Austria and northern Italy. Their records of feudal dues and taxes were destroyed. Many nobles fled. They're known as the Majority. And then Louis XVI was forced to fly the new tricolor flag. So changes under the National Assembly. I showed you what government was like with the king. Now here's the National Assembly. They abolished guilds and labor unions. They abolished special privileges of the elites. They passed the Constitution of 1791, which again kind of took power from the king and gave it to people. They passed the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which is essentially a Bill of Rights. Equality before the law for men, not women. Many nobles left France and became known as a majority. Reforms to local government. Taxes levied would be based on ability to pay, so it's graduated income tax. If you had more money, you would pay more taxes. If you had less money, you pay less taxes. That's the United States graduated income tax. And they attempted to rid the country of religion. They renamed the days to rid any reference to religious background, to Christianity, religion in general. They renamed months. They even extended the work week to 10 days. because, God rested on the seventh, so you shall work. So it's a 10-day work week where they work for 9 and then get the 10th day off to break the cycle of that 7-day kind of biblical reference. And then they told priests that not only can they get married, but they will get married under penalty of law. Why? Because priests, when they take the oath in the Catholic Church, when you take an oath to become a priest, your oath is to, it is a marriage. But it's a marriage to the church. The objective is that your goal is not personal satisfaction. You gain satisfaction from helping lead your sheep to heaven. So you are married to the church. You don't have time for a wife because a wife and children can take time away from your sheep, those whom you're attempting to give eternal life to. Well, again, trying to get rid of religion. They're like, well, screw that. You have to get married or off with your head. The Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizens provided freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, guaranteed property rights, liberty, equality, fraternity, unless you're a woman, right of people to create laws, unless you're a woman, right to a fair trial, unless you're a woman. They had an issue. They had some issues, some kinks they need to work out. There's an end of special privileges. Church lands were seized, divided, and sold to peasants. Blah, blah, blah. So as democratic features, France became a limited monarchy. The king essentially became merely the head of state. All laws were created by the legislative assembly. Democratic features, voting was limited to simply the taxpayers. So it's still kind of the wealthiest among them, but it was more than it had been. Offices were reserved for property owners against limited, but more than it had been. This was known as the legislative assembly. Then the royal family sought help from Austria. Marie Antoinette was Austrian. She was married to the French, with King Henry, or King Louis, to kind of help unite the two. Well, they weren't monogamous, and they both had their own lovers, and so she had one who was Austrian, who basically said, hey, if you escape, then to Austria, you can meet up with those who have escaped with you. You can help coalesce an Austrian army and come back and conquer these people and retake your power. So Marie Antoinette tells King Louis, we should go. We should do this. So they do. They leave at midnight one night under the cover of darkness. Now, to be fair, back then, nobody really knew what they looked like. It's not like they spent time out in public chumming it with the people. They were, remember, the universe revolved around King Louis. However, the postal servicemen who dealt with documents, federal documents, would occasionally see the king's portrait on papers. And so they leave at midnight. Now, they could have left in small carriages that would have been far more discreet. They didn't want to break up the royal family, so they actually left in one giant, ornate carriage, like, hey, let's escape on the cover of darkness, but be in the biggest boat we can find. And then they required fresh horses regularly. They mandated it. And then every time they stopped to get the fresh horses, which happened all the time as they're trying to escape, they got out and walked around. Were they wearing rags? No, they were still dressed nicely. So they ended up being many hours behind. They were supposed to have a military escort that was going to kind of help them, but they were so far behind because they were going so slow with this giant carriage, stopping to get fresh horses and getting out, walking around. It's just, I wrote this and I stand by it. Idiots. You're trying to escape and you make the slowest escape of all time. Well, so they get just a couple hours out of Austria. They were literally a couple hours from freedom. And a postman recognizes the king walking around from a document that he saw that had his face, his portrait on. He's like, oh my gosh, that's the king. Why are they out here? Where are they going? They must be going to Austria. So this guy jumps on a horse like a bat out of hell, goes to the next town forward, and he tells the Revolutionary Guard that's there, like, hey, the king is coming. Like, he must be trying to escape. They stop him, and they said, oh, no, you don't. Go back home. They died. Louis XVI is guillotined, and then Marie Antoinette, 9 months later, off with her head. Her daughter is allowed to go back to Vienna, or go to Vienna, because by Salic law, she was not able to ever take power.
However, their son, Louis Charles, or Louis XVII, was beaten and mistreated until he died in prison. And he kind of, by their concept, had to die because, again, he could eventually rise to king. And if Austria or any other foreign nation had come to try to reinstitute monarch power, he would be the guy to do it. So they kind of had to kill him. It was just a mess. And none of it would have happened if they had just taken a couple of small marriages and just got out of there instead of taking their time. All right. So you guys, the Reign of Terror, I'll tell you this. We don't have enough time to get into it. This really should be like an entire semester, but you get it in about 40 minutes. 15,000 people are beheaded by the guillotine. Gibson was the national razor. The revolutionaries turn on themselves, and at one point, Robespierre, who is the guy who starts this, the Reign of Terror, just beheading everybody. He eventually thinks, wow, this is getting out of control, and he gets beheaded for not being extreme enough. I mean, it's just a bloody, pun intended mess. 300,000 people are arrested. Reign of Terror ends. They get a new constitution. There's a new government, but eventually they just get tired of self-rule and say, "Oh yeah, hey, Napoleon Bonaparte to this coup d'état, like you take power now. We'll accept an emperor." In terms of the assignment, it's 3 parts. It's actually 2 parts, but 2 parts, 2 questions. The second part. So the first one is using this matrix, and by the way, this is just a doc file that you just fill out and then just save it and reattach to Loudfile. So use the matrix below to compare the views of thinkers listed regarding the source, their ideas of the source of political legitimacy and the rationale for obedience. So Paul, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, and then you get to choose 2 more. It's very much like just kind of pick your own adventure, so to speak. I offer a couple of choices in my lectures, but you can go anywhere you want. There's people who discuss political, government in general. You can use them. You have to have a minimum of 25 to 50 words per box, so it's pretty short, probably 2 sentences, but a minimum of 1 citation per row. So minimum 6 citations. And my presumption for that is that where you find information about policy and political legitimacy, you're also going to find in terms of rationale for obedience in government. So straightforward. Again, I kind of give you a couple options here. Then the second part is just 2 prompts. Then you use this to answer. So what is the purpose of government? Provide 3 different views from the matrix and identify the author of each in your answer. 300 or 500 words. Piece of cake. Got to have citations, but you're just citing from here. And then 2, why is political legitimacy important? Who or what provides a government with legitimacy? Use support from matrix and course materials to answer this question. Again, you just pull it from here to answer here. 300 to 500 words. Piece of cake. Here are the textbook sections to help answer. Of course, you got the lectures, you got secondary readings, and you've got the university library. And then, if you're interested in learning more about the American Revolution, the French Revolution, here are a couple of books, some documentaries, some movies, if you like pop culture, and then some YouTube lectures. I like to listen to lectures as like if I'm doing the dishes kind of thing, I'll throw on a lecture on a topic that I'm about to teach, just to kind of refresh my memory, or if there's something that I want to learn more about. So if you do kind of podcasts, I've listened to these lectures, I've listened to a lot more. But I recommend them. So just 3 books on the subjects, 3 documentaries, 3 movies, and 3 lectures. All right, let me just take this out of here. Any questions, comments, concerns, patience, switches with any of this? You guys are all good? Sweet. Who's hungry? I'm telling you, they should totally cater the 5 o'clock classes. Just give us like a fruit basket or something, right? I mean, like just, or meat and cheese. That'd be good. All right, Amy? No, Amy? Caleb? Dara? Emma? Is that here, Dara? Or no? Yeah. I did. Dara, very interesting. Okay. Erica?
Yeah.
Faith?
Here.
Garrett?
Jack, here. Jack is in. Jake. Here. Jake. Joanna.
Here.
Justin. Here. Justin and Kiana. Madison. Matt. Here. Dylan. Matt Dylan. Oh, okay, okay. So I have Matt and Matthew. What's your last name? Done. Okay, so it's Dylan's not here. Boyd. Is it Boyd? Oh, Boykin. No. Okay, so all right. Nathan. Noah. Here. Simon. Here. Sydney. Tara, excuse me. Tara? No. Taylor? Here. Did I not call anybody? I got it. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I love you all. Have a great weekend. I'll see you on YouTube on Tuesday. I'll see you in class on Thursday. Be safe, have fun, avoid COVID at all costs.
We have participation on the one days, and we just do the West Side.
No, you have to do full notes and what's it? Yeah, because you have to show that you watched the whole thing.
Yeah, I was in the group chat and like 8 hours just the West Side.
No, when students send with just what's it use, I respond, let them know that I need the full notes. And so I don't need to write everything word for word. You just got to show me that, like, hey, I followed along the list. That's all. So, because technically, you're supposed to participate at 5 o'clock on Tuesday.
Yeah.
So I just give you until Wednesday.
I think I sent mine right after the lecture.
Okay, perfect. So you just got to show, that you follow along with the whole thing. Yeah.
And then for the project, for the assignment, for the rationale part, like what are we putting there?
The rationale for legitimacy. So I covered that last week specifically.
Yeah.
So go through those lectures and I'll really discuss it.
Do we have the like who they are and the rationale for legitimacy part?
No, it's rationale for legitimacy and or hold on. So it's source of political legitimacy, their position on where's the source of political legitimacy, and then their position on the rationale for obedience to go.
Okay.
So I really dug into that last week.
I'll rewatch that.
Yeah. So.
Thank you so much.
Yep, not a problem. Hey, I got a thumbs up.